I've made up some remarks by way of introduction this morning. Dr. Annett, my name is Tony McNevin. You received an email from me a couple of days ago. Perhaps you can take the opportunity to get back to me on that. But in any case, this morning I wanted to start not first about economics or Catholicism, but about pigeons. You may find that a bit strange, but I want to talk about one specific pigeon, not a very ordinary pigeon. This pigeon is known as cher ami. You know, during the First World War, pigeons were the preferred method of communicating extensively over the battlefield. During the war, there was a group of Americans who were caught up in northwestern France behind enemy lines who were being bombed by Americans. And so they used the pigeon, later known as cher ami, to send their message back to command, and command was able to redirect the bombing and save the American soldiers. The message was crucial and important, obviously. And cher ami flew over the enemy lines and successfully delivered the message. And for his courage, cher ami is now taxidermatized at the Smithsonian Institution. Mm-hmm. I'm so thankful that Dr. Annett is not taxidermatized. I wish I could award him the Distinguished Service Cross, much like the one awarded to cher ami. Dr. Annett has reached back over difficult terrain, and perhaps even with some enemy fire, to retrieve and contextualize the treasured social teachings of the Roman Church. But more than that, he has applied these teachings to the challenges of our society, indeed to the world today. Dr. Annett, you have the unique opportunity to address a bunch of octogenarians. And despite our age, we are excited and we are thrilled you've come to be with us today. Dr. Annett is a graduate of Trinity in Dublin, received his doctorate from Columbia in economics. He spent 2 years with IMF and serves as an advisor to the UN Sustainable Development Solution. Dr. Annett will address us today on how the Catholic tradition can create a more just economy. Mon cher ami, Dr. Annett, thank you. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you so much, all of you, for inviting me to talk to you. I'm delighted to do so. Always willing to share talk about Cathonomics, Catholic social teaching, how Catholic social teaching it can be applied to create more just economic and social structures in our global economy today. So I'll talk for a little bit, and then we can just open up for discussion if that works. So I think what I want to talk about in the next 20 minutes or so is to argue that Catholic social teaching aligns well with the system that we have come to know as Christian democracy or social democracy, or what Pope Francis calls the social market economy. What does that mean? What is social democracy? Well, it's an acceptance of a market economy, but it says that the property rights of that market economy must be balanced by economic rights. So it supplies common goods, uses the welfare state to protect people, and boosts the power of unions to bargain for workers' fair share of economic progress. So that's kind of what social democracy is. I think it reaches its fullest international expression in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm thinking of Article 25, which says that countries are obliged to guarantee a standard of living sufficient to allow the participation of all people in the economic and social life of the nation. And that means they need to have adequate food, clothing, housing, healthcare, and social services and social protection. Now, we can contrast this with the system that we know as free market economics or economic libertarianism. And that's a system which basically says the only rights in the economic sphere that we recognize are property rights. There's no such thing as economic rights, and there's certainly no right to an adequate standard of living. Now, in the sense, that tradition harks back to Adam Smith's key insight that the invisible hand would harness self-interest and competition and the division of labor towards rising prosperity. It can also be traced in a sense back to the philosophy of John Locke, who held that property rights were really the only rights that mattered, and the proper role of government was to protect those property rights of individuals. Now, it's certainly true that markets can be good at creating wealth, but the problem is they're not very good at distributing that wealth, making sure that everybody benefits from that wealth. The market economy is quite simply compatible with vast amounts of inequality and exclusion. This is the jumping off point for Catholic social teaching. As we all know, starting with Pope Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum, Catholic social teaching has condemned the economic liberalism then practiced during the Industrial Revolution. It calls for the state to protect the poor and workers for just wages and for the rights of unions to bargain on behalf of their members. So we get this joint condemnation on one hand of free market libertarianism, hyper-individualism, and on the other hand, socialist collectivism, hyper-collectivism, as it were. But we always need to remember that when Catholic social teaching condemns socialism, it means the collective ownership of the means of production and the abolition of most forms of private property. It's most certainly not talking about what we call today social democracy. And this was most firmly stated in 1931 by Pope Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno, who condemned what he called the twin rocks of shipwreck. On one hand, individualism, which denies the social character of property, and on the other hand, collectivism, which denies the idea that people have the right to private ownership of property. These are the twin rocks of shipwreck, and both are condemned. So Pius explicitly rules out free market thinking, and he actually calls for markets to be directed by what he calls a directing principle. He says, from this source, as from a poison spring, have originated and spread all the errors of individualist economic thinking. That's a very stark, a very clear, a very strong denunciation of economic libertarianism, of free market ideology. And some Catholics today who defend the free market tend to kind of brush away or overlook these core aspects of the social tradition. Now, it must be said, however, that early Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno, didn't really embrace what we call social democracy today. So what did they support? They supported systems that we are now know as distributism or corporatism. So distributism is predicated on the widespread ownership of private property. So for Pope Leo, giving as many people as much property as possible would reduce inequality, increase social harmony, reduce class conflict, and boost prosperity. The problem is that this is a very nostalgic, romantic view of the world. It looks back at a world where you have smallholder farmers. Today, only 1% of the economy works in agriculture. So this is kind of a romantic, outdated view of the world that actually has very little practical application to how we would structure the economy today. What about the other system they talked about? This is particularly in Pius XI, corporatism. That's the idea that you divide society into functional groups that work cooperatively for the common good under the overall direction of the state. Now, again, this is more a romantic view of the past than a practical view of the future. Specifically, it looks back at the medieval guild system. Now, that really doesn't really have much to offer us today in the modern economy, which is dominated by large corporations. No, but by the 1930s, I would argue, and I'm referring to a book by James Chappell called Catholic Modern, Catholics became more comfortable with democracy and with the role of the state in economic life. So Chappell calls this bifurcation in what he calls paternal Catholicism and fraternal Catholicism. So paternal Catholicism means using the state to protect the family and the sole breadwinner. So that gave support to the welfare state to protect workers and typically male breadwinners, and also to the role of industrial unions, which, as we know, was always part of the social tradition. It was fiercely opposed to communism, but at the same time recognized that communism was offering something to workers that needed to be countered. There was no going back to the free market economy where workers would sink or swim depending on the stage of the economic cycle. Communism changed things dramatically, and defenders of the capitalist system needed to respond to that challenge. Now, the other aspect was fraternal Catholicism, which was more left-wing, more supportive of a larger welfare state, and more open to alliances with socialists. But by the 1950s, as Chappell documents, both strands had come together with the goal of supporting the new kind of consumerist modern economy, supported by a welfare state and strong unions. This was the golden age of both social democracy and Christian democracy. Catholic social teaching was heavily influenced by thinkers like Jacques Maritain and the personalist philosophers with their emphasis on human dignity. And there was also a strong overlap with secular social democracy, as, for example, practiced in the Scandinavian countries. You had, on one hand, so you had a number of pillars. You had the welfare state, supported by high taxes and social security contributions. You had strong unions as a bulwark against corporate power. And countries like Germany even went further in putting in systems of co-determination whereby workers had a share in the governance and management of firms and enterprises. Now, the United States never went that far in implementing social or Christian democracy, but the New Deal order, as implemented by Franklin Roosevelt, had some of its elements. It limited the excesses of the market. It sought just and harmonious industrial relations and protected people from a variety of market risks. And the broad contours of this New Deal order were accepted by both political parties during the post-war years, and they even informed the post-war settlement imposed on Germany and Japan by the United States and its allies. Nonetheless, social democracy in the United States had a more limited range. The welfare state tended to be less generous than in Europe. The extent of unions was more limited. But still, there was in both Europe and the United States what were known as the 30 golden years of social democracy from 1945 to 1975. You had the strongest prosperity ever enjoyed by a market economy. You had the lowest inequality ever seen. You had the highest employment and lowest unemployment. You had basically all-round economic success. for those 30 years. It's no surprise, therefore, that Pope Francis can claim that the church supports the social market economy, or as Pope Benedict XVI says, what he calls democratic socialism was and is close to Catholic social doctrine, and in any case has made a remarkable contribution to the formation of a social consciousness. Now, let me now talk more specifically about that alignment. This alignment would never have happened without significant developments in Catholic social teaching, especially the Second Vatican Council, and of course, the document that I'm sure you're all familiar with, Gaudium et Spes. It was with the council and with that document that the church finally made its peace with democracy, with the modern liberal state, and with the role of the state in economic affairs. And in my book, Cathonomics, I list 10 principles of Catholic social teaching that have derived from this tradition, from Rerum Novarum in 1891 all the way through Fratelli Tutti in 2020. And I have argued that those principles, like I list 10 of them, are very consonant with Christian and social democracy, and indeed have helped provide an intellectual foundation for the development of Christian and social democracy, especially in post-war Europe, to a lesser extent in the United States, but especially in Europe. So let me talk through those 10 principles of Catholic social teaching and why they're aligned with social and Christian democracy. Principle number one, of course, the most important, is the common good, which, as we know, is defined in Gaudium et Spes as the sum of those conditions of social life in which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. This has clear relevance to economic life. As Pope John the 23rd put it in Mater Magistra in 1961, as for the state, its whole purpose is the realization of the common good in the temporal order. It cannot, therefore, be held aloof from economic matters. I would argue that the state, therefore, is called upon to guarantee the common goods of our common life together, recognizing, and unlike with free market economics, that nobody can be excluded from the common good. Principle number two is integral human development. This was defined by Pope Paul VI in Popularum Progressio in 1967 as good of the whole development of the whole person and all people. So it calls for a far broader notion of human development than the material or the economic, emphasizing the fullest development of each person's capacities and capabilities. So you immediately notice that this sounds very Aristotelian, and it is. And in the economic sphere, it says that to fully develop in this Aristotelian manner, people need the material bases of human flourishing, such goods as physical and economic security, access to food, housing, healthcare, education, opportunities for decent and dignified work, and a sustainable natural environment. And of course, integral human development is intrinsically related to the common good. The third principle is another integral. It's called integral ecology. And this is the newest principle of Catholic social teaching developed by Pope Francis in his very important encyclical Laudato Si from 2015. And this says that the relationships between human beings and the natural world are deeply interconnected and part of a larger whole. So if we upset the balance of nature, we upset the conditions for human flourishing, especially for the poor. In the last century, this wasn't such a huge issue because, quite frankly, we weren't fully aware of the damage being done to the natural world of our economic juggernaut, but it must be a priority going forward, not only because it's an environmental concern, but because it's a social concern. Like Pope Francis always says, Laudato Si is not just a green encyclical, it's a social encyclical. And he says very clearly, we are not faced with two crises, social and environmental, but one complex crisis that is both social and environmental. Hence, we need a solution, an integrated solution that combats poverty, restores dignity to the excluded, and protects nature. So that's integral ecology. And it suggests that any future social democracy will need to prioritize the protection of the environment. Principle number 4 is solidarity, and that's most developed by Pope John Paul II, who defines solidarity as a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, the good of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. And that's the key point. Solidarity is the notion that all are responsible for all. It is like a superhighway to the common good, a moral response to the profound interdependence of modern human life. And in terms of the elements of social democracy, it calls for the protection of the weak through welfare states, but also for a strong role of unions, which are key domains, key arenas in which worker solidarity is actually practiced. That was very important for Pope John Paul II, who was very strongly supportive of unions, especially Solidarność in Poland. The fifth principle is related, often seen as a twin principle of solidarity, and that's subsidiarity. This is often, I would argue, misinterpreted, and sometimes by libertarians, I would say willfully misinterpreted. Solidarity means that decisions should be taken at the lowest level possible, but the highest level necessary. And by the way, sometimes that level is the global level. If problems are global, such as climate change, then subsidiarity says the proper level for dealing with that problem is the global level. But more generally, it says that higher level associations like the state must help and support lower level associations like families, unions, and civil society organizations. Pope Francis is very, very clear about that. He says what subsidiarity means is that when individuals, when families, when small associations and local communities are not capable of achieving their primary objectives, it is right that the state should intervene to provide the resources necessary to progress. So despite what libertarians might say about subsidiarity meaning a hands-off state, Pope Francis says the opposite. Subsidiarity means gives an excuse for the state to actually intervene in economic life to help lower level associations like families and unions achieve their ends. So this gives a clear injunction to support unions, as Pope John Paul II says, are indispensable elements of the social life. But there is also a justification for a welfare state to support individuals and families, so long as that welfare state is not provided in a distant, demeaning, or overly bureaucratic way, or which hinders the agency or dignity of people being helped. Pope John Paul II did warn about what he called malfunctions and defects of the welfare state when subsidiarity is not fully respected. So that's subsidiarity in its fullest meaning. The next principle, principle number 6, is a principle associated with Pope Benedict XVI, and that's reciprocity and gratuitousness. Now, contra Adam Smith, Pope Benedict was concerned with embedding a spirit of fraternity rather than self-interest at the very heart of economic life. He wanted people to be able to give a free gift to the person on the other side of the economic transaction without necessarily expecting anything in return. That's quite radical. The whole basis of our modern economic life is I give, so I get. Pope Benedict says, no, we should give maybe without the expectation of getting anything in return, giving something for free. Now, this principle of reciprocity is very important in economic life and human psychology. It is basically how people treat each other in the real world, and it's how social trust is built up. And it's also the bedrock of any successful welfare state, based on the idea that everyone contributes and everyone gets benefits. It's how social insurance works. You pay in to support people who need help today, knowing that you too will be helped when you need it. That's how social insurance works. That's how the welfare state works, based on the principle of reciprocity. Now, principle number 7 is very important. It's the universal destination of goods. This is central. This harks back to the church fathers, to St. Thomas Aquinas, to many Catholic thinkers, and it says that the goods of the earth are destined for all people, not just the rich, not just people with more property rights. This is a very radical principle that sends a direct challenge to how the market economy operates. Pope John Paul II says the right to private property comes with a social mortgage, and Pope Francis says private property is a secondary natural right, not a primary right as libertarians would have it, but a secondary right. How does Gaudium et Spes define the universal destinations of goods? It says that in using these earthly goods, man should regard the external things that he legitimately possesses not only as his own, but also as common, in the sense that they should benefit not only him, but also others. And as we all know, St. Thomas Aquinas said that private ownership must also always be twinned with common use. And in fact, private ownership of property is only valid to the extent that it serves this common use. Now, some have argued that the universal destination of goods belongs only to the domain of private charity, in the sense that people are called upon to use their surplus to relieve the poor. Now, this isn't wrong, but it ignores a vital institutional dimension. Gaudium et Spes says clearly that in richer countries in particular, a body of social institutions must bring to reality this universal destination of goods, or as Pope Paul VI put it in Popularem Progressio, when there's a conflict between private ownership and community needs, it is for the public authorities, it is for the state to step in to seek a solution to this problem to benefit the common good. Accordingly, therefore, the universal destination of goods can provide a key intellectual defense of modern social democracy. This is very closely related to principle number 8, which is the preferential option for the poor. This says, to put it simply, that all human action and public policy should be judged first and foremost in terms of how it affects the poor and the excluded. This is a marked departure from free market economics, which says that those with the most property rights can get the most resources in the modern economy. Catholic social teaching completely puts this on its head. In a sense, it's related to John Rawls's difference principle, which calls for the position of the least well-off person to be maximized in society. And this principle calls on government to take measures to relieve the poor and to eliminate poverty. And again, this can be used to defend modern social democracy, which tends to have lower poverty rates than, say, a free market country. It's no accident that poverty is lowest in the Scandinavian countries and it's highest in countries like the United States, which tend to be more free market oriented. Principle number 9, getting close to the end now, principle number 9 is economic rights. Now we need to unpack this a little bit. The church came quite late to the idea of modern universal human rights. It was only with the Second Vatican Council that it made its peace with some of the rights of liberal democracy, including freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. As we know, going back to the 19th century, popes like Pius IX condemned these rights of liberalism. And that really dogged the church for quite a long time. The opening was telegraphed by the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when you had theorists like Charles Malik, who was a Lebanese Christian, and Jacques Maritain, both of these men very influenced by Catholic social teaching and the social encyclicals. It was Maritain who argued that all traditions could accept human rights, even if the reasons for accepting those traditions differed. And in the Catholic social tradition, the reason for accepting human rights is based on kind of a natural law that people have rights based on the natural law and are always oriented towards the common good. Now, here's the key point in Catholic social teaching. The key rights in Catholic social teaching are not civil and political rights, they're economic rights. If you go to Pope John the 23rd's brilliant 1963 encyclical, Mater et Pacem in Terris, he says very clearly, he lists the rights of Catholic social teaching, a very detailed list of rights. What's the first right? He says man has the right to live. So the right to life is the first right. But what comes after that? What comes after that is economic rights. He says the means necessary to the proper development of life, food, clothing, shelter, medical care, rest, the necessary social services. He has the right to be looked after in the event of ill health, disability, widowhood, old age, unemployment, or whenever through no fault of his own he is deprived of the means of his livelihood. These are the rights of social democracy, and these are the primary rights of Catholic social teaching. These rights are not even recognized by libertarianism, and they're not really recognized by the US Constitution. Franklin Roosevelt in 1944 proposed a second Bill of Rights to codify economic rights, but unfortunately, this idea died with FDR himself and it was never revived. So that's economic rights, principle number 9. Finally, principle number 10 is justice. Very important, obviously. Justice means giving people their due, what is owed to them. And It is central to social democracy. It's also central to Catholic social teaching, and indeed is regarded in the tradition as a cardinal virtue. Now, as you know, there are three types of justice in Catholic social teaching. There is commutative justice, which is the justice between two individuals. This is the justice of contracts, agreements, promises. Everybody accepts commutative justice, even libertarians. A market economy is not going to operate without the basis of commutative justice underpinning it. Crucial. Distributive justice is rather different. This is what the community owes the individual, and as such is the justice of social democracy, not recognized by libertarians. Libertarians argue that the community owes nothing to individuals. Individuals are on their own, they have their property, and they can do what they want, free from government interference. But social democracy says distributive justice is important. The community owes individuals what is needed to support the common basis of economic life. And of course, here, Catholic social teaching aligns once again with social democracy. Finally, there's contributive justice, which flips distributive justice on its head and refers to what the individual owes the community. Examples of contributive justice might include voting, participating in the civic life, paying your taxes, and leaving the environment in good shape. This is related to the idea in Catholic social teaching that every right is attached to a corresponding duty. It reflects also the principle of reciprocity embedded in social democracy. But of course, the role of duty has no role to play in free market economics. So there are my 10 principles of of Catholic social teaching. And I've argued in each one that these principles align very clearly with Christian and social democracy, especially as practiced in post-war Europe, countries like France, Germany, and Italy and Austria for Christian democracy, countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, for social democracy, very clear overlap to a lesser degree to the New Deal order in the United States, which lasted from 1933 to approximately 1975. So that's basically the theory. Now, in practice, as I said, we know that that period was the 30 golden years, high economic growth, full employment, low inequality, and hardly any financial crisis. It was a time of high taxes. It was a time of strong unions. It was a time when workers were able to share fairly in the fruits of economic progress and inequality was low. But we kind of threw all this out the window after 1980 with the advent of neoliberalism, which went back to an older notion of free markets that was looked upon with deep suspicion by Catholic social teaching. This embraced free trade, free capital mobility, financial liberalization, and a hands-off role for government, including by lowering taxes on the rich, curbing the power of unions, and deregulating finance. It promised soaring economic gains from unleashing the potential of the market, but these gains never materialized as economic growth since 1980 in the neoliberal era was actually lower than in the previous social democratic era, but inequality was much higher, unemployment was higher, and there were far more financial crises, culminating in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which was the greatest crisis since the Great Depression. So we see the failures of neoliberalism, skyrocketing inequality, low growth, stagnant real wages, rising economic precariousness, the hollowing out of the working class, rising unhappiness, a mental health crisis, and deaths of despair. This is all leading to social and political dysfunction and a rise in the political far right, which is offering easy solutions to complicated problems. And hovering over all of this is the existential crisis of our age, the environmental crisis, most specifically climate change, so profoundly and prophetically described by Pope Francis in Laudato Si and Laudate Deum. This is why I have called for a new social democracy, once more underpinned by the principles of Catholic social teaching, attuned to the specific challenges of the modern day. So that's my talk. I hope I have persuaded you that Catholic social teaching is related to social democracy, had a lot to offer in the past, and still has a lot to offer in the future if only we Catholics can reclaim the glories of our tradition and kind of offer this tradition to the world as a guide to how we can have a healthier economics, a stronger society, and a healthier politics. Thank you very, very much.
Dr. Annett, my only complaint with you and your book is that some of us, when we were in theology, sat through a semester on social teaching. It was the most boring, disengaging exercise I have ever gone through in my life. The only eye contact the professor had was with the transom that brought air in and out of the doorway of the classroom. And I suspect that in many cases, the teaching of social Catholic teaching has suffered because of instruction of that nature. Um, uh, I, uh, I feel so strongly about this. I wish that we could have incarcerated Milton Friedman and his buddies from Austria for introducing really another social religion.
Yeah.
I think neoliberalism so strongly characterizes the way we think and believe in the United States. It is extraordinarily destructive, and it
Yeah.
has undermined, if not destroyed, the concept of the common good.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there are many, many questions. So allow me to suggest that those of you who wish to ask a question of Dr. Annett, that you raise your hand. I'll recognize you and we'll go through it that way. The big guy over here on the right or the left, Bendick, you're first.
Thank you.
Monsignor Bendick, I should say, Dr. Annett.
Tony, excellent job. Thank you so very much. I have a question that has an impact on everything you said. You've mentioned it in the past when you were preparing your book. You didn't have much information on artificial intelligence, but since that time, now into 2020, that your perception of the impact it would have on the economy and people and jobs and unions and all that stuff has gone from perhaps 40% to 70%. My numbers may be wrong, but my question is, that is something that's off of the future that we're going to be dead, but where they're going to have people are going to have to face. What is your thought about how artificial intelligence has an impact on everything that you just said to us, shared with us?
Yeah. So when you look at what the impact of technology, my first question is, does that technology benefit workers? Not does it benefit the owners of capital? We know the answer to that is yes, it always does. But does it benefit workers? And sometimes the answer is yes, it does. So, for example, during the Second Industrial Revolution, which was really the revolution brought about by electricity, the internal combustion engine, modern chemicals, that benefited workers in the period, say, 1920 to 1970. Workers' wages rose and there was rising prosperity. The problem is after 1970, you had technology which most definitely didn't benefit workers, and that was automation. So basically, the assembly line in factories, instead of having workers, you had robots. Those robots took the job of workers. They made a lot of money for the owners of capital, but the workers lost their jobs in manufacturing, and the only opportunity they had to get other jobs was in the services sector, which paid lower wages and didn't have unions to protect them. So it's really awful if you have a worker who goes from an auto factory paying decent wages, good healthcare, good pension, loses his job, and is forced to go work, say, in an Amazon warehouse for crappy wages, no benefits, no pension, and no union, and a very kind of horrible system of monitoring his every move of his workday. So that's been a very negative benefit. Now the question is, what will AI be more like the post-war technological development that benefited everybody, or will it be like the post-1970 automation which didn't benefit workers? And I think the jury is actually still out on that.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite possible that AI simply replaces a lot of jobs, not just blue collar jobs like automation, but also white collar jobs like lawyers, like accountants. If AI can do this kind of stuff very simply, then we're in a whole world of trouble. But it's also possible that AI can create new tasks for people to do. That's how technology can benefit workers. And there's actually some tentative evidence that AI benefits low-wage workers the most. This would be a complete reversal from what we saw with automation. So I think that's a complicated answer to your question.
Very good. Thank
Sorry
you.
if it's not a direct answer, but I think the answer is the jury is still out, and it could actually go either way. Yeah.
I think it's important to have it as part of the conversation, though. So that's why I brought it up. Thank you very much.
Can you imagine what a delightful world we would have without attorneys? Nick Rice.
No, actually, I can't.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Nick Rice. Nick Rice is next.
I was surprised in the book that you didn't deal with the amount of resources that should be shared around the world with those in need, but are not shared because of all the wars that go on. We waste more money on wars through history and in our present day than we would ever dream of sharing with the poor of the nations. And until that problem somehow gets settled, I think we're going to continue to be selfish in our resources and very selective. So I just think you look back in history, and even today, the amount of money that is thrown into conflict is keeping so much poverty in different parts of the world that should be helped.
Completely agree. Here's a number about that. Let's say you want to give $1,000 to the poorest billion people in the world. Now, that's not going to make them rich, but it will certainly alleviate the worst forms of extreme poverty. A billion people getting $1,000 each costs $1 trillion. That's 1% of world GDP, $1 trillion. The world spends about $2 trillion every year on military spending on wars. So you have your answer there. That's the priority. The poor are not the priority. weapons are the priority. And
Mhm.
Pope Francis is very, very strong about that, about how that is money dripped in blood.
Weapons and insanity. They just
Yeah.
started a story on last night about the $1 billion palace that Putin has built for himself outside of Russia.
Yeah.
So it's all over. And I don't know how you go about changing all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah.
You
I-
know,
I would
I
suggest
can just,
that,
oh, never
Jack,
mind.
I'd suggest that all of you may want to come to Pennsylvania and sign up for Elon Musk's $1 million giveaway.
Yeah, I never thought we'd see the day where the world's richest man is trying to bribe voters so he can have lower taxes.
Yes.
Jack Farmer.
I was just going to mention General Eisenhower back in the, I guess, the late 50s warned us about the military industrial complex, or conflict or complex, I guess union would be a word. That just to further the discussion on the wars that we're in, and it really bothers me. We all feel bad for the Ukrainians and what the Russians have done to them, but I wonder if as soon as they started asking for money, we started dishing it out to them for arms and everything. And I'm not sure if we helped them or if we killed so many of them that maybe we did more harm to them. I don't know, but it's terrible. That particular war. Well, they're all bad. All wars that we get into. It doesn't seem like we accomplish much when we get into these wars from Vietnam on.
Yeah.
And the things going on in Israel now, and that's I don't know what the solution to that is. I mean, we've contributed a lot to them too to keep that stuff going, and I understand why they want to keep it going so that the people that are fighting them, if they don't do something to stop them, they're going to keep blasting missiles at Israel and everything. So I don't know what the solution is. I don't know, but
yeah.
it's expensive. We've spent a lot of money in those two places recently.
I don't apologize for my political proclivities when I say that Mr. Eisenhower was, I think, the last best Republican president that we had. Bob.
Yes, in your book, Dr. Annett, you say, quote, a host of prominent economists have called for a new approach to economics, including a new approach to teaching economics. Is this call for a new approach with a better grounding of economics and ethics, is that widespread, or is it just only a few?
Well, it's spreading. There are so when I was doing my PhD, when I was studying economics back in the 80s and 90s, the discipline was very free market. It was very into markets. Markets will work wonders. Today, there's much more of a focus in the discipline on inequality, on the need to raise wages, and in that sense, you need unions. So yeah, there's definitely been a shift. And for example, the Nobel Prize this year was won by 3 economists who talk about the need for good institutions for economic development, and not just free markets, but broader based institutions. So there is a shift going on. I think that when it comes to teaching basic economics, there are some attempts to reform the curriculum, and I'm involved with some of those attempts, but not nearly enough, I would argue.
Father John Osterley.
Tony, thank you for your book and your presentation. The Republican Party certainly seems to favor free markets, less government regulation. But how would you criticize the Democratic Party at this point? If you're willing to make comment there.
Well, I think that they basically have become too comfortable with the language of neoliberalism. And they've kind of lost the social democratic tradition, which was based on a strong working class base. And so my main criticism is they no longer talk to the working class in language that appeals to them, the language of economic justice and fairness. And they appeal too much to kind of the cultural concerns of the upper middle class with advanced degrees. So that would be my main criticism of the Democrats. I think Joe Biden has done a lot of work to move away from that, but there's still have a lot of room to go. Yeah.
Dwayne?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It seems to me this new gospel, if you will, has its greatest meaning in the application. Last night I heard an hour-and-a-half lecture on how we have maltreated the Native American population in this country. What kinds of strategies are being developed out there because it doesn't has any meaning until we apply. So what kind of strategies are there any going on now to apply what you talked to us about this morning to make a difference in life for the people who are less treated than we are?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, we are kind of in this liminal stage between neoliberalism and what comes next. And it's a liminal stage because we don't really know what comes next. We know that kind of both left and right parties are kind of become more skeptical of neoliberalism. But what comes next, we don't know. I've been very encouraged by the Biden administration's move towards things like industrial policy, using the state to promote a developmental agenda. I've been very happy with some of his attempts to boost the welfare state, including the child tax credit, which, as we all know, in 2021 reduced child poverty in half. And for some reason, we just didn't let that lapse for some bizarre political reason. There's more of an interest in unions are having a moment right now, even though, only 6% of private sector workers are unionized. So there's a lot of big uphill battle to go there. But we're in this liminal state, and I don't know what's going to come next, but I think that neoliberalism has passed its peak.
Is there a champion anywhere? I don't see it in any political party. I agree with you about Biden's efforts, but it just seems there's somebody. I mean, Pope Francis, he's only a human. He's one person. So where is there anything churning in any leadership that we're seeing across the world, even around all these principles we're talking about now?
Not really seeing much. I mean, Pope Francis is the world's moral leader, and there are very few other people in that position, unfortunately. So yeah, nothing comes to mind, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I was so impressed, negatively impressed, when this past spring, auto workers were seeking to organize in some of the plants in Alabama and Mississippi, et cetera. And the Southern governors got together to warn the citizens and the auto workers that if they unionized, it was going to become more expensive to live in Alabama.
Yeah.
The cheapest state with the poorest education and the poorest number of people in the United States, and we want to keep it that way. I have no basis to challenge you, Dr. Annett, but it seems to me that neoliberalism is alive and well and is going to be with us for some time.
You might be right. You might be right about that. Yeah.
Yep. I have a question. Your message, your lecture is well received by people like us with a strong Catholic background, maybe not too well informed about the social teachings of the church, and that's really unfortunate. What has been the reception of your book within hardcore economic circles?
It hasn't had too much of a reception there, to be completely honest. There's been a couple of very favorable reviews. I mean, there's among people in the know, there's an understanding that Catholic social teaching has a lot to offer, but it's still a very niche understanding. Of course, the book was criticized by some Catholic libertarians and right-leaning Catholics on grounds that you would find typical, unsurprising actually. But that's kind of why I wrote the book, to kind of reclaim this tradition against. You've had over the past few decades in the United States, you've had Catholic thinkers like Michael Novak and George Weigel and Father Richard John Newhouse, who have presented what I think is a very distorted view of Catholic social teaching, and not a reliable guide to the tradition at all. And I wanted to write the book to kind of counter that.
I wouldn't be surprised that there are some U.S. Catholic bishops who might take exception to some of your books.
Well, I got an endorsement by a cardinal and a Vatican bishop, so that's good.
Oh, congratulations. Congratulations. I have one last question. This issue, this discussion is a highly intellectual one, right? I mean, there's not too many people around the globe or in the United States who perhaps feel comfortable dealing with these kinds of issues. And so if there is a Catholic mission to do this, it's really incumbent upon laity to really implement these strategies, to be imbued with these values. And as we've seen, both in Catholic and in structured Protestant churches, people are leaving the pews in droves. It raises the question for me, who's going to carry the message besides this lonely Irish academic?
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer to that question, unfortunately. Yeah. But we need lay Catholics to step up. And as the problem is, as you pointed out, younger people in particular are just leaving the church. They're turning away from the church because they see the church being allied too much with right-wing positions, including on economics, unfortunately. So they're just walking away. So it's incumbent on us to kind of say, like, we have this amazing tradition. Here's what it says. And you're not going to distort it. We're not going to let you distort it. It's a very clear tradition.
I think a lot of young people are walking away from the church because they don't know the church.
That's true.
They don't know it. We haven't bothered to say. They come to me and they'll say, I don't know, church is boring. I said, let's see, the church educates more kids, feeds more poor people, take care of the elderly, go down the list. Is that boring to you? Is that boring to you? We don't bother to educate them to the broad work of the church.
Yeah.
One guy said, I don't get anything out of going to mass. I said, well, that's for your case, that's kind of like going to the bank and wanting to withdraw some money when you've never made a deposit.
Right.
And I think a lot of them are that case. They want something but it's quick, easy, and don't bother me. And I
Yeah.
think we need to challenge that.
Yeah, yeah.
If they leave after being challenged, they leave.
Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, I think, guys, I need to go now. So if
Right.
that's okay.
Tony, thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you,
Dr.
sir.
Yeah,
Annett,
not a
Thanks,
problem.
Dr.
Thanks
Annett,
for-
I
thanks for
did
inviting
send you
me.
an email. Dr. Annett,
Yeah,
I did send you an email. If you would please take a look at that.
I will. I
Thank
will.
you. And
Yeah.
Steve Brown, I apologize by my awkward reference to attorneys.
As I
Thank
tell
you.
my pastor, if the Lord were walking the world in the world today, he'd be a trial lawyer.
I think we
Take
ought
care,
to,
guys. Thank you
I
all
think-
very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Tony.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
thank you. I think we ought to incorporate and start raising hell.
By the way, just to inform all of you, I had a visit this past week from a priest friend from Oklahoma City, Father Don Wolf.
Oh,
Really,
Don Wolf,
good-
yeah,
good-
from
good guy.
NFPC days.
Yes, he succeeded me, and he brought a lot of information about his first cousin, Stanley Rother, who will be canonized a saint sometime this year.
Okay.
He went into the back mountains of Guatemala and became church to them in ways that are incredible.
Wow.
So we had a wonderful visit, and hopefully sometime this past year, he will be canonized. And I think that's probably what's going to have to happen in terms of how we reach out to the world. People go and they give their heart and soul, for his heart is still buried in the church in Guatemala. His body was brought back to Oklahoma City, but we had a great, great visit together. So
Can I jump in and say that the Catholic social teaching is a treasure that needs to be shared? I have found it difficult as a priest to find opportunities to really share it. It doesn't fit into the homilies. I mean, at times it does, but you can't overdo it. And to have a discussion group on a book like this, maybe a few people would come, and maybe I need to be humble enough to say we need to start small and see where it goes. But it's hard to teach the Catholic social teaching. It's always ends up as one-on-one charity or plea for justice.
well, I felt like I was sitting through his lecture here today, receiving a fire hose drill sent at me all at once, all the time. And I found it to be too much. I couldn't remember it. May be true, but you can't teach that in ways that either bore people in language they don't understand or give them too much at one time.
Mm-hmm. I found his book very helpful.
Yes.
In his book, he really explains it.
Yes.
And
know,
his
I
two
wonder-
articles in Commonweal, I thought were very good. Also, he does a lot of summary in there. Regarding teaching Catholic social teaching, the Ignatian Solidarity Network has an Education for Justice website. You might try pointing people to that. But they have a lot of very good articles there. And they will be posting a review of the book by Dr. Annett, I'm sorry.
Could the Catholic Church or the public schools, could they, I don't, maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me they could teach some of this in school about basic economics, to maybe when you're in 7th and 8th grade, kids start thinking about working when they get into high school. And we never had anything like that at St. Meinrad when I was there. And I don't remember it ever in high school or grade school either. Teach them basic things, maybe cut some of the other stuff out that they teach, in fact, and have a course in how to save money, and give them some commonsensical things, ideas about don't buy the most expensive shoes, like the big Nike shoes that kids like to buy for $300 or something, and don't buy the most expensive cars. Kind of indoctrinate the kids on that, and how to get what to do to get a job when you get older, and even maybe to invest in the stock market that we have. How do you do that? And maybe some of these poor kids could learn that, and maybe we don't like capitalism as much, maybe, but maybe that would help them. Maybe they could share in the profits with the companies if they get into, teach them how to get into mutual funds, give them a course in it. And I think it would help them if they got a job, maybe at McDonald's to begin with or something, and then take some of that money, maybe 10% of it or something. It's not a lot, but put it into a mutual fund and learn how it grows. Just teach them about index funds or something. The S&P fund, it goes up probably an average, I don't know, 15% a year or something. I don't know what it does, but something like that might help.
My recommendation would be teaching them how to join a union or how to organize a union. I think that, when we were very proud, the unions were very strong back in that 30-year period they talked about. And, a lot of salaried employees don't realize this. I worked for a labor union for 10 years, and I worked for a company that employed labor union represented and salaried employees. The company I worked for, many of the salaried employees did not realize that because the union negotiated great benefits, retirement, health and welfare benefits, short-term, long-term disability, and savings plans, 401k benefits, that they benefited from that also. So even those that aren't represented by a union, they benefit by the labor union negotiations. And that is something that people do not understand. I think many of the people in our company, the General Dynamics Corporation, eventually came to understand that. So you had salaried employees cheering for the labor unions whenever they went to negotiating tables. But I think that would make a big difference in the economy. My 2 cents.
And I think how we use our language talked about common reciprocity and gratuitousness, destination of good, integral ecology. I think people get lost in all those terms.
Yeah.
Use the term the gospel. Yeah. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. I spent probably 40 years of my life advocating for disadvantaged people of all classifications, the poor, elderly, disabled, etc. And what I learned over time, we have to figure out ways to get to the power base. And sometimes those power bases are right along what Bob just said about groups. AARP, for instance, if AARP would adopt some of this that we're talking about this morning, they've got national reach, they've got national audience, and they've pretty much got national credibility. So to me, my sense is, I used to deal with that, try to go to the legislature, to the very top, because those are the people who could command the attention of whomever they're trying to communicate with.
That's right.
The question I had of the doctor was, where are the spokespeople of some renown who are starting to announce this message, this gospel, to whomever they can get to listen to it? And I believe there's got to be a way for that to happen, because we're in kind of a mess right now. Sad to say.
Well, the bishops wrote a document called Economic Justice for All in the 1980s. But we don't hear anything about that anymore.
No.
I don't hear it from any of the bishops. I don't hear any reference to it.
Yeah.
They went there once before, but all we hear are issues about, opposing abortion. I don't mind hearing about opposing abortion, but I'd like to hear other messages that are pro-life messages also.
All right.
But they had a good opportunity. It seems to me they ought to dust off the economic justice for all that they wrote in the 1980s, updated and recirculated. That would be a good start, in my opinion. Of course, there's no one asking me for my opinion.
Yeah. Or ours.
When would that ever stop you, Bob?
I lost you for a while because actually my plug pulled out, and I'm wondering why I have a dark screen. So I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to the two Tonys. But I'm a mentor for one of our deacons who's in our class. He'll be ordained next November, and currently their topic is Catholic social teachings. And I read his papers, and they're excellent. And I asked him about his other colleagues for the program. There's another 7 guys in the program, whether they're dealing with these issues in the manner in which he's dealing, because he's dealing with them in a very positive way, and I'm very happy about it. So our deacon classes in this diocese, at least, are being exposed to Catholic social teachings. I can't speak for what's happening in our high schools. I'm sure it's just a blur, like it was a blur for us when we were at St. Meinrad.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Jack, I'm glad to hear that. I went to Mass yesterday and the deacon preached, and he talked about the political situation, talked about being pro-life, and the only topic he mentioned was abortion.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I just think that there's a whole range of pro-life issues. When we narrow it in, it's basically, and I said this to him afterwards, you're telling me to vote Republican.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And well, I'm glad I spoke up to him. I didn't do much good, but
Yeah.
I spoke my piece. Yeah.
Well, the Pope tried.
I've been wishing that Duquesne University would use this book, Cathonomics, in the economics classes. I should get my butt over there and talk to some of the economics professors. Yeah. Other schools in the area are going more right wing in terms of economics, including St. Vincent's in Latrobe, where a Benedictine school where I went for high school. They're going more to the right.
Yeah.
Scary.
Yep.
It's where the money is, and they want the money.
Yeah.
You know what I miss? Some years ago, George Higgins, Monsignor George Higgins used to write this column, The Yardstick, which used to be in a lot of diocesan papers. But, that was a source of great information about Catholic social teaching. And there's no one like George Higgins now writing a syndicated column, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah, some people do it in different ways. John Carr does it.
But he didn't have a syndicated column that appears every week like Higgins used to have. I don't.
That's true, but he has that Georgetown lecture series. Yeah.
My book club is reading something called A Fever in the Heartland. If that could become a similar title for something good, this is about the Klan.
Yes,
It just makes you want to throw up every time you read it.
Scary as hell, isn't it?
What? Yeah.
It's scary as hell.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
But if you think about what we're talking about here for almost 2 hours,
especially in Indiana.
Fever.
Yeah. Well, the other book I talked about was The Afternoon of Christianity by the Czech writer. I forget his name right now, but it's a small book, but it's called The Afternoon of Christianity. He makes some wonderful principles about what's happening and what we need to make sure that we help move along.
Don't you think that thought is like a tide? It ebbs and it flows. Wasn't that long ago people were just screaming about liberal institutions and how they were stilting education in one direction. Maybe it just has to ebb and flow, the old thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And maybe this is a healthy thing that we're going through.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm scared about November 5th.
Yep, we all are.
Yeah.
I see Sunny down, the highest Sunny. I didn't get to greet you when you came on. Sunny just had his 84th birthday. I had my 83rd. So a
Yeah.
lot of celebration. Well, let me ask you about the future. We still have 4 segments of that book on questioning God that are available. If you want to continue with it, the next session will be on November 18th. It's chapters 12 and 13. 12 and 13. I'm going to be looking for someone to facilitate it. I'm not going to pull ears or anything, but it's getting more difficult as we get along. And the other thing is suggestions for what we will do after that. Okay, so if anybody wants to volunteer, just text me or email me and let me know. You can look at the pages. I think I've sent that out when the next sessions are for you guys to volunteer.
Mhm.
So
You know,
Jack,
Steve or Jack, would that interest you?
Steve.
Steve Brown, Jack Farmer?